to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Happy October. I can't
that's
say
the month.
October.
There you go.
We're here.
And also today, a very special guest, Minister Mark Ashton.
What's up, team?
Is in the building at the table. Around the horn? I don't know what it is. But anyways, you're here.
I'm at the edge of the horn.
Yeah, welcome. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about, not a little bit, actually a lot about politics. And this was kind of spurred by an article that you had sent us from Carey Nieuwhof called 5 Critical Insights for Leading a Divided Church in a Partisan Age. So we're going to be kind of dissecting that a little bit, but also injecting some of our own thoughts and how it relates in our current context and culture here at the church. But Mark, why don't you start us off? Because I think off air, you had kind of mentioned a story or an encounter you've had recently that kind of pertains to this.
Yeah. And I hope by the end, we get at what's the story behind the story. So, we all know that we're very politically divisive in our era right now. And you have to ask, why is that? Why is it more than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Why are we unable to have civil conversation? So that's where I hope we're going to head with this. And one of the things that kind of blew it up in my mind was about 6 months ago, I had a couple of family members who had come to town. And so we had a delightful day touring Omaha, checking out the zoo, seeing the old market. We sat down for lunch at the old market. And then they just really started to pigeonhole me on political conversation, particularly related to the church. So their opening question was, how many people in your church are Republicans and how many are Democrats? And I told them, we don't survey that.
Yeah.
I don't even have I couldn't even give you an idea about that because it's not on our radar screen. And then they said, do you excommunicate people for being Democrats in your church?
Oh.
And I said, well, of course not. And I'll bet there's some weird outlier churches that do that. But in the hundreds of churches I know, I've never even heard of that happening. They were very convinced that that was a normal thing in evangelical churches.
Wow.
And then they asked me, how often do you preach about President Trump? And I said, well, if I ever mention candidates, I always mention both either critically or complimentary equally so that we have a very nonpartisan kind of a view. Why are churches so political? And then they had some very strong opinions to the point where I just started pulling out my toolbox of ways to help change conversations. So
Your coping skills. I'm
coping
so proud
skills,
of you.
right? Ask an intriguing question, crack a joke, change the subject, until I got to the place where I had to say, I think it's time for us to stop talking about this. And as I reflected on it later on, the conversation ended with me saying, I think it's time for me to pay the bill and go get the car. And I actually left the table. I left my family members sitting at the table and went to the car to cool off and come back. You guys know I've got a pretty long wick and pretty good conversation skills. And so this was a weird situation for me to be in. I had reflected that I think 7 different times I tried to drop the conversation overtly or change the subject. It just didn't happen. And I'm like, man, if this is happening to me, this is a common thing that's going on. Because the folks I were talking to are intelligent. One's got a PhD. One's got a master's degree. They're articulate people. They're well integrated in society. But their views were very extreme. And they were really insistent that I fit the model of what their views were. So it was a challenging subject, and it got me asking the questions. What's the story behind the story for them personally? And, of course, you guys have experienced tons of people in the church and other friends who have said, my family has broken apart over this. We can't have Thanksgiving together anymore. And we have to ask what's behind that, and how can we be kingdom people in the midst of that kind of pain?
Yeah, do you think in that moment, what do you think would have satisfied their argument for you just to admit the things that they believed about you? Would that have even satisfied it? Or do you think, because I think so many times in these instances when I've been involved in that situation, it feels like it's just about the other party winning the argument. And even then, I don't know if that's a satisfying resolution for them at that point.
Yeah, I don't know what a satisfying resolution would have been, or what they're like, if they talked about it in the car ride there, they're like, what we'd really like to do is, I don't know what the really like to do thing is because there were so many questions that for me were out of left field. But one of the things I realized is that they live in a small echo chamber related to their views. And so they begin to believe that these things that are just for us like, wow, that's a weird idea. To them, they're very persuaded that it's a fact. And to have that challenged by somebody, I'm like, well, I kind of live in the church every day, so I know the answer to these questions. Was something that was very surprising to them.
And you probably said things that were unexpected too. I'm sure that they were asking things expecting you to answer a certain way.
Yeah. We've excommunicated 4 Democrats this year, and they would want to know why. But it's not even in our world.
Not happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. And obviously, I think part of this conversation where Carey takes in this article that he's talking about, but at large, is that the election isn't like those conversations, all of that isn't really about the election. And you talked about this earlier. It's about just systematic things that are deeper than that. Obviously, we're moving into a more post-Christian culture, and even Christians, they feel threatened. We feel threatened by change. And so there's some Christians that are really fighting to win culture back, Carey talks about inside of that. And so because of this, I think for us as Christians, it's a difficult spot to be in when it feels like we have been pigeonholed into, voting with a certain block or things like that. And media will essentially tell you that this is, Christians vote this way, especially certain places. And so I think it's just interesting to figure out what are some of the symptoms that we think are below the surface. Like it's not just about 2 names on a ballot at the end of the day, but what are the symptoms that are driving this rancor, the people being more and more upset, than they were a couple decades ago. Like I wasn't voting a few decades ago. Like I voted, this is my I don't know, 5th election maybe I can think of. And I remember the first 2, it wasn't like this. People had yard signs in, 2 different neighbors had, Bush sign in and maybe Obama, and they were still friends. Kids could play in the backyard, but it just seems like we are in a spot. You put a yard sign in that's the opposite person. It's like you excommunicate your neighbors for those kind of things.
Or it's gone the next day.
Or it's gone and then it's on next door asking who stole your yard sign. Yeah. But that's a whole different thing. So what do we think are some of the things below the surface, I guess, to that? It's a very long, very, very long question that I set up there.
It's a great question, though. One of the first pieces that I would roll into this is the general rejection of the idea of truth. So you go back into the 1800s, and we have the modernistic worldview that emerges that's very much based around scientific fact and truth, and that lasted pretty strong through the 70s. But getting into the 80s, 90s, 2000s, it begins to erode where people are believing that a more pluralistic or postmodern kind of a perspective, that my truth is the right thing. And for a while, there was a kind of, hey, I've got my truth, you've got your truth, and everything's fine. But then it emerged into, I've got my truth, and if you disagree with my truth, then you're wrong. And everybody should align to what my truth is. And the pluralism and the relativism that was behind it winds up becoming more and more personalized. Then we've added to that this idea that if you disagree with me, now you're my enemy and you should be silenced. And this happens both from the right and from the left. I think both sides are guilty of doing this. But if you begin with the assumption that there is no objective truth and we're not allies trying to reach a truth claim together, but instead it's a power battle. So if you go into Nietzschean philosophy, the whole idea is that there is a will to power that's behind everything. Modernism said there's an objective truth that we're pursuing, but postmodernism, based in Nietzsche's philosophy, is that there is a will to power, and I need to establish my power over you in order to get my truth dominant rather than the truth that we're pursuing together.
Yeah, you mentioned Nietzsche. How do you think that impacts Christians' identity and sense of security when like we know the truth of Scripture and the Bible and what we teach on Sunday, but how does that? Sometimes it's hard to correlate that into our day-to-day lives, into those conversations with friends and family and neighbors. So how do you think we balance that, and where, how does that impact Christians when they don't even know how to maybe have those conversations when people reject truth?
Yeah, I think it's a broader cultural dynamic rather than a Christian dynamic that's here. I would guess that most Christians aren't aware of Nietzsche's philosophy and the way that it's impacted postmodernism today. So, those who are cultural thinkers will be thinking about that. I think the typical Christian just swims in the water of relativism and to varying degrees buys into it. So some Christians would say, hey, I've thoroughly bought into this idea. Others are still living in a more scientific, modernist type of a viewpoint where they're pursuing truth, and they feel a little bit like out of a fish out of water because I'm swimming in these relativistic waters, but I believe in something that's true, and I'd love to have dialogue around that. So different Christians, I think, have different flavors of where they're at in working these things through, but we're all swimming in the postmodern waters. And we're dealing with that with other people, whether it's something we've internalized or not.
And when it comes to people's truth, whatever that may mean to them, I find that a lot of times it's in service of justifying their opinions. So, or if you were to say something, you could be a party member, you could be a Republican talking to a Republican, but if you had maybe a critical opinion of a leader in that party, they would try to defend them just because in their mind, to say anything negative is to show a lack of support for this politician or whatever. And so then you're obviously out of lane, out of pocket. We got to fix this right now. I got to shove this ideology down your throat because you obviously don't get it. Like, we can't talk bad about whoever because then, you're not supporting them well. And so how do we, to me, I think that's been the most frustrating thing in my own life is like how I think even in the Christian world, we have to be critical of our leaders to affect change and growth and accountability. And if we can't have those conversations, then what are we left with other than some form of a dictatorship?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think in the kind of dichotomy of the will to power, we put people in the all good category or the all bad category. And we, just as wise people, need to be a lot more nuanced than that. We need to be able to say, hey, I agree with this person on these issues, this person on these issues. That guy's got a real character problem. That lady's got a real lying problem. And whoever we're talking about, I think we need to be honest about the full set of who that person is. Because there's nobody who's all good or all bad. And there's nobody who I'm going to say I agree with everything they have or I disagree with everything that they have. There's just a lot more shades that are in there. And I think we Christians and the broader culture would be wise to live in the shades a lot more than in the absolutes.
But it also seems like I'm even thinking about, I see people from all generations, like even as a therapist, and there is this deep processing that's happening where a lot of people grew up in churches or in families where this is what you believe and this is what you don't believe. And there's, I think, a lot of anger that fuels that. Like, if you didn't think this or you didn't do this. And so there's a lot of people that are processing like on their own. And so it seems like there's this like tight hold on to, well, this is my idea and this is my belief and this is what I believe for myself. And it's capitalized on a lot. And I think it's covered in anger. And so then it's like, okay, well, you're mad about this and you didn't get to this as a kid, or you were told this by your church, or you're told this by whoever. And it's like anger is almost turned into a business where it's fueling what we think or what we believe. And it's like, how do we slow down and even like process through that when I think it's used as a tool, like something that people are maybe genuinely feeling? It's like, no, feel that more. Like, let's fuel this. Like, be angry. And then if somebody doesn't believe what you believe, well, what's talking about it? Like, let's fight about it. I mean, it really does turn into this feels like a battle to me.
You know, I've heard therapists say, I'd love to hear your view on this, that anger is actually a mask emotion
Totally.
for other real emotions.
I'm not trying to get too into it, but
No,
yeah,
but
yeah,
please,
totally.
I was going to say, tell us what is anger usually a mask for? What's usually under the surface?
Anger usually masks hurt first, or it can mask like a secondary emotion. So it would be like a more vulnerable thing. So it's like, I'm going to show you mad, but you've really hurt me, or you've really said something that embarrasses me. You've really said something that like is at my core, like affects my identity.
It's good. I also have found powerlessness is something that anger is a mask for. And I think that that's another underlying piece of this dialogue that we have.
I agree.
Yeah, people by category oftentimes feel like if I don't get my right person in office, it's going to disempower me. And I think, you know, some folks from our minority communities, some African Americans legitimately have gotten a tough rap from their past. There's generational disadvantages that they're experiencing. And so they're trusting in politics to be able to say, hey, how can I move from a less power-filled position to a more empowered position? And I think white folks on the other side are saying, you know, as I look at the political landscape, it seems like they're trying to pull me down rather than lift them up. And I don't like the pulling down part, so I want to elect people who are not going to be pulling me down, you know, not doing justice at the expense of me, because it feels like they're pulling me down and they're not being lifted up, so nobody wins in that scenario. And I think the fear of that, the fear of losing power, is oftentimes one of the underlying emotions that's behind the anger that we experience.
Yeah, and I think politics have been monetized for a long time, but in recent history, like the monetization and the echo chamber, like you talked about earlier, it's so much easier to live in an echo chamber. And most of us, whether we like to admit it or not, are living in some sort of one, you know, because if you look at each of our Netflix or Prime, whatever we're consuming, the algorithms are just going to continue to feed us those kind of things. So you have to work even more to see things from another side or another point of view and all those kinds of things. And so what do we think just the monetization and the inescapability of that? So you used to be able to, okay, I'm not going to buy this paper because they maybe lean one direction or not. I'm just not going to subscribe and I'm not going to read it. But it seems like it's everywhere. Even in pop culture, you know, celebrities feel probably more than ever, at least I've seen it, a need to speak out and to endorse a candidate or whatever. And so it just seems like when there's money involved and fear really drives this and all those tactics that get clicks and all the clickbait, how do we fight that when it's just always everywhere? No matter you bank, you know, then banks have to take like a stand for things like that, and they'll have to post, you know, certain flags during Pride Month, or they'll have to post certain things. So it feels like it's just so intertwined in everything that we're doing. How do we, one, become aware, I guess, that we're in an echo chamber and how deep we are? And two, how do we just acknowledge that and fight against it? Because it seems like a battle that's almost impossible in some ways if you just engage and live life in culture to just fully reject. Curious thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think admitting it is an important piece, and you know, adding to what you've talked about, the news channel that you choose is an echo chamber. You know, news channels have largely become propaganda arms of a political party, with Fox News on one side and the alphabet media on the other side. And they're really, you choose a certain media, you're going to hear the thing that you want to hear from that media. You mentioned Netflix, but our social media, same kind of deal. They feed us the stuff that keeps our eyeballs on the longest, and they're registering all the time, what are we looking at, what do we like, and they're going to feed us more of the thing that we like anyway. So whether that's politics, or for me, you know, I get golf ads and men's polos and all these kinds of things because they know that's the stuff that I watch when I go on social media. So whatever it is, you're fed more of that. And so it's going to bend you towards extremism.
Yeah. Eric is someone that, like, I think does, like, lives in this world, you know, online and marketing and things like that. What are your thoughts on, like, how do we how do we figure that out? How do we navigate that in just wise ways when it is kind of everywhere and maybe there's some tropes that are out there?
Yeah, I think it's just it's probably challenging because people don't realize it's kind of like putting the lobster in the cold pot of water and then you start turning the fire on. And I don't think people realize they're in an echo chamber until it's too late. And so, they're dipping their toes in something. They click on a link to a certain article, maybe a friend sends them something, and then all of that time data is being collected on them. And then it's also the way you search. So you're not going to go out searching for things that conflict with your personal viewpoints. You're going to go out searching for something that you already kind of agree with, or try to find someone else who has the same opinion to justify what you believe. So you have more ammunition when you go into a conversation with someone who disagrees with you. And so I think as you start to interact with social media and the internet that way, it's before you know it, you are just locked into this echo chamber of your belief. And I think that kind of leads into the next thing we were going to talk about, which is like identity and ideology around that. Is because so much, I think why it's so personal, why it's so hurtful for people to have these conversations, why they get so passionate about it, is because they can't separate who they are from their political beliefs. Mm-hmm. So if you insult a politician who is in the party that I, assign myself to, then you're hurting me. Because this is who I am. This is who I identify. And we see it in everything today, whether it's brands or gender politics or whatever it may be. People put their identities obviously in something other than Christ, and that you can't go against that because you're going against them. Mm-hmm. But I mean, at the core of that, I think what breaks my heart the most is just like, I really have a heart for people. I care for people. And so wherever they are, like I want them to see their value, and I want them to see their value in Christ and what they have to offer the world. But when you can't have just a sensible conversation with someone because they're so tied to some sort of identity that they've, developed with politics or whatever it might be, it just makes it too challenging to break through that layer, I think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was last night, happened to be the vice presidential debate, and I've watched, the presidential debate. And I was just thinking as I was watching it and scrolling through social media at the same time, which you used to not be able to do. You used to watch it, at night in your house, form an opinion, all that kind of stuff. Then maybe the next day at work or wherever you're at, you would talk about, how this went. Mm-hmm. But now you're like watching it in live while those teams are tweeting out fact checks. And then you've also got people like either side saying how stupid somebody said was. And so you're like, even as you're trying to engage in people having a dialogue or debate, when there actually is a civil one, you're even taking in all this information too of, I need to say something. It almost feels like if you don't say something, then you're not standing for truth, or that you're not making your point known or your voice. There seems to be this social pressure even during those times of like, if you don't speak up, you're a coward. Mm-hmm. And so, which does go into our identity, because I want to be somebody that fights for truth. I want to be somebody that stands up, for whatever, marginalized, oppressed, stands for truth. I mean, in scripture, I think Christians, John 8, it's like, hey, you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. And I think we have this conviction that's a core part of our identity as truth keepers as Christians, that it feels like, to your point, Eric, it's difficult because I feel like that's my identity. And if I don't do something, then I'm, sinning by omission, by not giving people my thoughts on something, especially when that's the time. This is when people are going to listen. If I don't say it now, 2 days from now, nobody's going to care about it because it's going to move so fast. So I got to capitalize now. And so that's such a part of like every time I do that and I'm engaging, I have to like literally fight back. Like there's so many times I'm starting to type on somebody's thing to start to debate, family members, other people. And I'm like, okay. Yeah, this is just it's not wise. It's not going to go anywhere. Let's just slow down. But that's because I have this thing that rises up within me to like start to fight the injustice or the things that are not true that I see. And I want to, that's just a part of who I am. And so it's a difficult thing to wrestle through in my identity with that.
Mm-hmm. So why do we think the ideology is becoming a substitute for our faith-based identity. Even I think we're seeing that in the Christian culture more and more, where people are aligning to a political party as, you know, this is synonymous with my Christian faith, instead of finding their identity in Christ. Why do we think this is happening? And maybe let's talk a little bit about how we can fix it or work towards changing that.
Well, I think on the why is it happening portion, oftentimes Christians make the mistake that our job in culture is to create power over other people in order to help them to live in a moral framework that matches our worldview. And when we look at the way that culture is going, a lot of people, and I would say it trends towards older people, mostly because older people have a longer memory of the way things used to be, that they say, I feel like culture is changing too fast in the wrong direction. And if we don't change something, there's a threat that the good that we had is going to be taken away from our kids and our grandkids. And so we respond by saying what we want to do is to establish a power center in order to reinforce our worldview over other people who are all around us. And sometimes that's very well intentioned. Like, I want to decrease crime. I want to decrease poverty. I want to protect our kids from the dangers of the internet and other important things like that. But the problem is that we place our hope in the wrong places. So instead of saying, I'm placing my hope in the internal power of the Holy Spirit to revolutionize a human heart, I'm placing my hope in our investment in our kids, in being a servant, in being subversive in our culture, because that's Jesus' perspective was, I want to have power under and lift people up rather than have power over and reinforce my will on people through laws and other power structures. So Christians, I think a lot of Christians get confused about that. And when we take our identity in Jesus, who is the suffering servant, who gave up his life as a ransom for many and who died on our behalf and went through injustice and all kinds of pain, well, we have to say, I'm going to identify with Jesus as the suffering servant, to enter into culture, not as a Roman centurion enforcing my power over people, but as Jesus who came to suffer and serve.
I think this is an area that I really struggle in, because even like when we're talking about like fighting, or like Alex, you're talking about like responding to a post online, I don't feel that like often. And I am as sassy as the rest of them go, but there's just like a part of me that does not engage politically. And I think we've even gotten feedback like on the podcast, like of that maybe comes off like I don't care. But it is such a, that's not true. Like, I care just as much as the next person, but I don't feel like it's expressed in like, okay, I need to fight for this. Or like when I'm processing it, it's not like I need to stand for injustice. And I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I do think that it comes and it affects my identity, because if we, like last week, Alex sent us a political quiz. And it is consistent for me through this election and the last one too, where I frustratingly am smack dab in the middle. And so I feel like, okay, well, I want to be friends with people on this side because I really like them and I want to be friends here. Why can't we just all get along? And I think that I see it affecting relationships, people that I love, like people in the church. And can we speak a little bit to the people that are in the middle, and just like even just how that affects relationships? And I'm like, I don't know. Is there a way for us to all get along? Like maybe not. But it's like it's where I feel like when we're talking about this, like my soul gets like, okay, Jess, you should want to fight for something. But I'm like, I do care. Help me. But I think I do see it affecting. Like,
we just need to go back to when the losing candidate just had to be the vice president. I think, what was it, the 12th Amendment or something back in the 1800s, when it used, like, if the party that lost, they would just become the vice president, and then they had to work together, right?
Is that how far back that my thinking goes? I don't know.
I'm just saying. I feel that way too sometimes, where I'm like, how can you? There's good. I think I've heard other speakers talk about it too. It's like there are sides of Scripture that reflect the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and their talking points, and there are sides that reject both of those too. And so it's one of those things where how do we have? It just feels like there's no oxygen left in the room to have that conversation, though, because you're just whatever you say, you're aligning with a side.
Yeah. I would also reinforce that there are sane people on the right and the left as well. Mm-hmm. I gave my extreme example at the beginning, and I would say that was unusual for interactions that I've had with people. That was kind of the most extreme example. But there are people that'll have great conversations with you. I think it happens best in the context of a friendship where you already know that you love each other.
Yeah.
And regardless of how this conversation goes, we're still gonna, play golf tomorrow or have our kids do a play date or whatever the next context is going to be. And that you can assume the best of the other people and build bridges among commonalities. In fact, I thought that the vice presidential debate was a great example of that. Alex was talking to me in the hallway earlier and just said the big shocker of the debate is how civil they were with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I noticed at least 5 different times where somebody built common ground with the other person and said, we agree on this piece. We disagree about where we're going to, how we're going to change that. Or, J.D. Vance says, my heart goes out to you for your son witnessing that crime.
Yeah.
Christ have mercy. And you go, okay, those are bridge building moments that humanize the other person instead of dehumanize the other person. And I thought these two guys did a much better job than the president debate did in terms of treating the other person as a human being who some of what they have to say is valid. Yeah. And when we do that, when we're in a place where we say, hey, I know I'm going to disagree with this person on some things, treating them with humanity and acknowledging the places that you have common ground gives you a place to start with where you can build towards something that will be even more common ground or just a clear definition of here's where we disagree and we can still be friends.
And I think that when it becomes difficult is when you cannot even make that kind of claim that somebody that would vote different than you is sane. Like, I think there's a lot of people that think if you align this other way because I'm passionate about, something that I can't even get to a point where I could make that kind of declaration that somebody would ever, and I see some of those, how would you ever be able to without even being able to have those kind of conversations. And usually if someone's like, how would you ever, and making that kind of line in the sand, then I'm like, well, they probably don't even want to engage about it anyway. They've already kind of made up their mind that anybody that would vote or think or something that way just is an idiot, And so
or
that's where it's
even
difficult.
I've seen pastors, maybe quote unquote, even celebrity pastors make comments about candidates being under demonic influence because of whatever reason, or they are demons themselves, literal demons or things like that, to where it's like you're not just dehumanizing them, you're demonizing them, and you're telling all these people that look to you for spiritual guidance to believe that this person is a demonic force. And I just think you can't, how do you back yourself up from that conversation and find common ground after that point? It seems almost impossible. But
yeah. Well, and not only that, but even if you're listening only to pastors, there are some who will consider one side to be satanic and other pastors that will consider the other side to be satanic.
Exactly.
And so you've got different sets of Christians that are following a particular pastor that are saying, hey, the other side is not just evil. They're under the influence of the enemy camp and they have to be defeated.
Yeah.
And the truth is that's just way too extreme. People are a mixed bag of good and evil. And sure, there's powerful forces in this world that are influencing people and particularly targeting politicians. But to put either one firmly in the camp as opposed to the other is just way too extreme.
I feel like that just makes me feel tired. And I was glad that even Carey in the article talked about just the exhaustion and burnout that comes from the extremism and the other things that are so charged in this conversation. Even just the unkindness, the tones that are taken, it's a lot. And so can we just speak a little bit to I think the constant state of this is just wearing people out, burning people out. And then what's the church's role in building rest and being a place of rest and hope?
It's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
I would say there's a couple of things with that. One is in the don't do this, and the other one is in the do this.
Yeah.
So one of the don't do this things, and this is just a great tip, we've talked about this before on the podcast, is don't try to have this conversation with 500 people at once. Mm. And anytime you post on social media, you're trying to have the conversation with 500 people at once. Mm-hmm. And
good point.
In order to walk in a way that's savvy, these conversations need to be had eyeball to eyeball with 1, 2, 3 people at a time, not with the masses, because you're just going to invite the most emotional misunderstanding that you can when you do it with the masses. I would say the second part on the do this piece, you asked what kind of place does the church bring, is we bring rest in the sovereignty of God over all things. Amen. When we get all torqued up over who's going to be the next politician and am I going to lose power, we're losing perspective on the eternal matters that are out there, that God is sitting on his throne, God rules, evil is going to be trounced in the end, everything is going to be made right, and in the much shorter run than that, we are all going to die and we're going to face judgment, and what's going to matter is the things of the kingdom. If you're a historian and you look at the rise and fall of empires, every empire rises and falls, and the United States is no different. It is going to fall at some particular time, and when we get that resolved in our hearts that, yep, things aren't going to be good here for forever, things are going to fail and fall apart, man, it just presses us closer into the heart of God, and it gives us the ability to rest in his sovereignty, his goodness, and his peace, rather than getting wrapped around the axle of politics.
But how do we do that when... Because some people, if I make declarations like that, are like, well, you're just being passive. We are called to steward, this moment. God put us on this planet right now, and you're just being, talking kingdom and, talking about that. That's just being passive. It's just not doing your due diligence as a believer that God has placed right now in this culture with influence to also make real life effects and changes and be kingdom bringers now. So we know, hey, we're a part of a kingdom that is going to last forever, and that one day that kingdom will fully be reigning, but we're called also to be people that are bringing that peace and that shalom Amen. And that kingdom into a broken place and into spots where there is evil. And so how do we, I think that's probably the $1 million question. How do we live as real members of both of those kingdoms and do our civic and, kingdom duty to really balance that well? Like, how is it possible to balance that well, and how in the heck do we do it?
Well, if I can give a hearty yes to that and a few quick tips, I think that might be helpful at this point. Number one is God doesn't call us to passiveness, but our activity should be as agents of peace and agents of change and agents of goodness and agents of justice. The problem comes in when Christians say, I'm going to be an agent of anger. I'm going to be a prophetic voice. And the Bible clearly says, put away all rage, malice, and anger. So our job is to say, okay, I should never be responding out of those emotions. And if we find ourselves responding in anger interpersonally or in social media contexts, we're doing it wrong. It says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. So the Bible is really clear that this is not a right motivation. And if you feel self-justified in your anger because something's wrong, you need to go back to Jesus and say, Jesus, how can I be an agent of your peace in the midst of this, not an agent of anger? Then our activity moves towards, what can I do to be somebody who brings about justice? How can I establish love in my neighborhood? How can I be the kind of person who radiates Christ to every single person that I'm around? That is not apathy. That's high activity for bringing the kingdom. So when Jesus taught us to pray, he said, pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But it's through us. It's the kingdom of God being lived out through us. And that does not include rage and anger. It includes being bringers of peace and love. You can adopt a foster kid. You can go volunteer, in North Omaha. You can bring food to folks who are in a crisis. There's a jillion things that you can do to be those non-apathetic bringers of peace in our culture.
And I think to your point earlier, Mark, that you were talking about what is behind anger. Some of the most angry people that I know about this stuff are people that I think just feel helpless, and they're not actually doing those small things to bring the kingdom, Right. And so that when you feel like I don't have the ability to just affect my neighbor or my neighborhood school or whatever, then I think you realize my voting, like that's how and if I can get as many people to vote the same way as I do, then that's how I'm going to make change. And so we fall into this place where like we really convince ourselves of that, and we make our entire lives around doing that rather than being about our Father's business and being, and most of the people that I know that are most active in communities and loving people and caring for people, they are not like, they don't even have the time to be posting all the time and convincing everybody who to vote for, but and those are the people that I want to know, you know, like,
exactly,
man, what do you think about this? Like, and then those people are much more nuanced, you know, and they have an ability to have conversations and honest, you know, criticisms about people on both parties or whatever. And so it's just that interesting thing is that I do see that the most angry people I know are probably the people that are bringing the kingdom of Christ the least amount in their lives.
It's really insightful.
I mean, about a month from now, we're going to be having an election. And at the end of that, you know, obviously one party is going to come out on top and the other is going to lose. And it depends on who you are. That could look like the end of the world, and you see people react that way. Like this, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Now we have this person in power and it's over. How do we as believers lead that well with other people? How do we stand beside them and go, no, that's not what that means? And how do we, you know, if we are that person who's listening right now, who maybe we really do believe that if the party I'm not voting for wins, then I don't even know what to do. I won't even know how to function that next day. You know, like how do you comfort people? How do you bring people peace in that? And what's, I don't know. I think what's a practical way? Because I think it's just so hard when you've had so much emotion invested in something and you've believed something so fully. It's really hard to walk away from that.
You know, if I'm allowed to quote myself from my sermon last week, one of the things I said is, hey, we've got to get registered, get informed, and vote. But what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't worry about what the outcome is going to be. And here's why I think we can do that. A is the sovereignty of God, and we've talked a little bit about that we trust that God raises and deposes princes. And sometimes he does that with people who are really good, and sometimes he does that with people who are really evil. I think there are candidates that are better and candidates that are worse, and we should vote our conscience to get the better people in. But what happens if a worse people gets in? You know, if somebody we think is not the right person that gets in? Well, I think there's two things. Trusting God's sovereignty, that he's got it under control. Sometimes having opponents to the Christian faith is something that will actually stimulate the kingdom even more because Christians get more on board with doing the things that Christians should be doing anyway. But the other thing is, I mean, this is just kind of a reasonable view of American politics. We've put in checks and balances in our positions of power so that no one person who ever gets elected can take the whole trajectory of a nation totally off track. And it's one of the beauties of being in a place that's not a monarchy or a dictatorship, but we've got three branches of government that balance each other out. And we've never gone radically off the tracks in any 4-year administration. So I, as an old guy, you know, I've seen, 12 administrations, 13 administrations go through in my life. Well, they make incremental changes. And whoever you vote's going to make incremental changes, but nobody's going to radically devastate or revolutionize in a 4-year cycle.
And it's funny you say that because I think a lot of times we see the repercussions of those changes, you know, after that president's already out of office, you know, and then the next president can either choose to blame them or take credit for what happened. And I think too, when you look at a political spectrum from left to right, and you put even the candidates that are running right now, it's not that dramatic. Like there are definitely some differences that you can point out, but it is not like we're completely going, you know, communist or Marxist versus, you know, Hitler or something like that, like people would want to say. And so I think people can find comfort in that if you can just find the commonalities. And even I think a lot of times as we've had this conversation, the conversations I've had with family, I still think a lot of times at their heart of it, when they're trying to convince me I'm wrong or convince me to believe like they believe, if you look at it from their perspective, you understand that it is a lot of times coming from a caring place, because they've convinced themselves that they're on the right side, and they really are just concerned that maybe you just don't get it, you know, like, oh, okay, well, you're naive, or maybe you're just whatever it is, and like, and so I've had to even kind of put myself in that position a lot, where I go, okay, I think I understand what you're trying to tell me, and just go, all right, yeah, let me think about that a little more. Let me pray about that a little more, and let me try to see the world through your eyes, because it's just challenging when you know they want you to change because they care about you. And that, I think, to me, when I started to look at it that way, I felt less anxiety, maybe less anger over it, and just more of like, okay, well, this is coming from a good place. The way you're going about it is not good, but at least I can understand that, like, the heart behind it, you know?
It's good.
Quick question, Mark. We'll all do my own question mark here.
Question mark. You got to text that in, you know? You can't just say it.
If two people are praying, you know, for guidance here, God, tell me who to vote for. Is it feasible? Do you think it's feasible for God to tell two different people, you know, a husband and a wife, or a cousin, two cousins, two random people that are both love Jesus, and they're both like, I don't know what to do, and we would tell them, hey, pray about it, ask the Spirit to be helping you. Do you think two people could get two different answers from God, or does God even function that way, where he's like, that's the box to check, that's the box to check? I think a lot of people are wondering that, like, as Christians, like, okay, I want to vote my conscience. I really want to sincerely pray about this. But what happens if we both say we prayed about it and we end up in different places?
It's a great question. I have never heard that question before. Have you guys heard that before?
Just now.
I don't have a standard answer for you on that one, Alex, for sure. Part of what I think I can say confidently is that Christians can vote their conscience and vote different ways. So they can feel very passionately, and they may weigh different issues with different weights with really, really good motives. Does that mean that they heard from God on who to vote for? Whew. I think that's an in-depth question that, you know, I think both of those Christians would say, I did not hear God's audible voice, but I sensed the prompting of the Holy Spirit based around these issues for these reasons. Yeah. And that I would say in that sense, yes, in the sense of hearing God's voice, like, you should vote Kamala or you should vote Donald. I don't think God would do that directly, differently, person by person. Okay.
I'm going to just put both signs in my front yard and like a fleece and say, take away in the wind, whichever one flies away tonight, or the kids steal, I'm voting for the next. No, totally kidding. But I do think because we weave it together, like you were saying earlier, with so much spiritual stuff, you know, that it becomes a difficult thing. And when people are both convinced that they voted for God's man or they voted for God's woman, and that God led them towards that, you know, that's where it gets very difficult, when people are like, they play the God card and two people are playing the God card, and it's like, well, which one's right? And I think that creates a lot of, when we insert God into the equation as not just sovereign, but as the chooser, you know, that's telling us who to choose and which box to circle in, then it gets really, really messy. And I want to be somebody that's, you know, not overextending the God card and not, as Carl said, tells us a lot of times, it's not taking the Lord in vain, isn't necessarily saying OMG, but it's like inserting God's will into your own decisions. Yes. And that is dangerous territory to tread in. And so I think as we use the God card, or we are tempted to use that, like he gave us more permission, I think we just have to be wise when we say those things, because those are things that are said, you know, by Christians on both sides of an aisle or political ideology. So I just think it's just wise. You know,
that was a better answer than the one I gave.
Well, I don't know.
Well, Mark got to quote Mark, so I'm going to quote Mark too. There was something you said during the Hearing God series that said God cares much more about who you are becoming than your circumstances. That may not directly apply to this, but I do think it does in some ways. Is when you're it's kind of like that decision in your life. Like, where do I move next? What's the next thing I do? Like, is God going to come down and point you exactly in that direction? And I think when it comes down to presidents, it's kind of that same thing. It's like, at least I'm convicted to believe that God does care less about the circumstances of the kings that are ruling, but more about the person you're becoming in Him and your walk with Christ. But
It's beautiful.
And also to quote Mark, and that's good news.
yeah,
Amen.
there you go. Now we all got.
Now we all.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're kind of finding a natural resolution to this conversation, but I would like to leave some space if there's something if anybody feels like there's room for something that we missed, or you wanted to share a point that you haven't had the opportunity to.
I have one more point. I've had plenty of opportunity to share, but I do have one more thing that I've been thinking of. And that is, I think one of the best ways to interact with sanity, with the external world or with fellow believers, is to cultivate humility in your inner life. To be able to say, I might be wrong, or God, help me to see from somebody else's perspective, or help me to love somebody even when they're being mean to me. That kind of humility will drip out onto other people when you're around them in the heat of the battle. And what we want to have happen is when people bump into us in ways that are offensive, we want to splash the Holy Spirit back onto them. We want to be so full of the Spirit that it just is naturally diffusing and life-giving. And, I'll just confess, I've got some room to grow in that area. And obviously my opening illustration is one where you go, man, I know there's ways to do that better, and probably what I need to do is cultivate humility in my private life better, so that when those public situations come up, it's just much more natural for me to exhibit that.
That's good. That's good. Any other closing thoughts or takeaways or encouragements?
I just feel the pressure to have a Mark quote at this point.
Yeah, I know. I'm really disappointed in you, Alex.
I've been listening.
You've only been listening for 14 years now or something.
I know. I'm sorry.
No, this has been really good. Mark, thank you for your time today and sharing your insight. And thanks to everybody out there who's listening to this. Hopefully this didn't stress you out too much, and hopefully you're better equipped and prepared to enter this election season with the confidence that Christ is on the throne, and that's all that matters. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to us on social media, as always, on TikTok or Instagram at CCCOMA Podcast, or you can send us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org, or our favorite way is voicemail. We'd love to hear your lovely voice right here on the podcast at 402-885-9930. But until next time, we'll talk to you then.